Hello YouTube, Sidekick here in, for me, what is a very special day because I am sitting in the cockpit of a DHC-6 Twin Otter in RCAF Search and Rescue livery, which is something that I have wanted to do for a long time. The Twin Otter is one of my all-time favorite aircraft for a lot of reasons, personal reasons and also technical reasons. So I am thrilled that the Twin Otter has been released, and really thrilled that Aerosoft has done such a fantastic job with the model. So I'm going to do a little bit of a review today. But the full reviews have been done by other channels, other channels with a lot more viewers than mine. So I don't think I'm going to try and repeat anything that they have done. There are some specific things, though, that I want to talk about the Twin Otter that are interesting and a little bit unique to the airplane. So I am going to do a cold start just in case anybody's interested in starting up the aircraft. And then I'm going to focus on three different things today. The first is the power management system, and particularly the interaction between the throttle and the props, which is described in the manual but still takes a little bit of getting used to, but also enables some very impressive performance. So when we fly, I kind of like to take a look at what the way the props and the throttles work together, what they do for you, particularly in your ability to get into and out of fairly tight spots. I also want to take a look at the autopilot. It's probably not completely unique to the Twin Otter, but it is different than the typical glass cockpit autopilots, but it is a very effective autopilot. And I also want to do some VOR navigation today, because that's really what the Twin Otter wants you to use rather than the GPS, although you can use the GPS unit. So I often rely on GPS when I fly in other aircraft because it's so easy. But Twin Otter gave me an opportunity to practice some VOR to VOR navigation. So that's what we're going to do today. And we are on the tarmac in beautiful Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island in Canada, and we're going to fly across the Northumberland Strait to Moncton, New Brunswick. And part of the reason we're going to do that is because it gives us an opportunity to do a very direct VOR to VOR flight plan today. We'll get into that in a little bit. First of all, let's get this airplane started up. When you first get into the cockpit, you'll have this control lock installed that you have to get rid of. And we have to stow that. Once it's stowed, we can check to make sure our controls are in fact functional, which they are, and then we'll get rid of those because they really do get in the way of looking at the instruments. So as far as the startup procedure goes, we start on the center panel here between the two pilots, and we're going to check over all of the fuel settings. We want to make sure that we have fuel, which we actually get down here even without power. These gauges don't read until the power's on. We want to make sure the boost pumps are off and the emergency boost pumps are off, and that we're not seeing any indications that we should not there. Then we're going to take our flow up to the top panel here, and we're basically going to check that everything is off, including the generators. We are going to turn the position light on since we're about to start the aircraft. Then we want to check and make sure that the flap lever is all the way back, that the props are all the way forward, the fuel levers are all the way back, and the throttle is also all the way back. And with that, we are ready to start the aircraft. Click quick check to make sure that our props are clear. And we're going to look up here, and we're going to turn on the internal battery, and we are going to turn on the master electronics. And I'm going to take a quick check and make sure that all the electronics are coming up. We've got our two Garmin screens. Everything else is initializing. Quick check to make sure that all the dials seem to be reading where they should be, and we actually are recording a fuel quantity now. All right, looks like we are ready to start the right engine. We start with the right engine because the passenger door is on the left, and so we like to start with the engine away from the passenger door. First thing we have to do is turn on the boost pump. We can hear it starting. And then we're going to go up here and hit the starter. When we hit the starter, we start the turbine turning, and you can see the turbine coming up there. We're going to wait for it to get to about 20% where it should stop and stabilize, and at which point we're going to give the engine fuel and it should ignite. And we're going to try and hit just the right lever here. And you can hear the ignition start, and you can see the turbine spool up, and now you can see the prop following it up as well. That little click sound was that the igniter, the starter, has gone back to the middle, which indicates a good start. We got a turning prop, and we're just going to wait to see where that finishes up. Like to see it around 40%, which is where we are, and we got engine instruments in the green. So now we just need to repeat the process on the left. Fuel pump on. Get it started. And we're going to wait for the generator, for the turbine to come up, sorry, the gas generator turbine to come up. And then we're going to give it some fuel. And we're going to hear the ignition, see the prop start, and we're going to watch the prop, and we hear the starter come back to the middle, which is good. And we look like we have a good start. So the last thing we need to do is go back overhead now, and we want to make sure that we are turning our generators on. And we'll take a look, and we have no generator lights, so it looks like we have a good start. Now, because we're flying in a Twin Otter, we don't actually need a pushback. We can do this ourselves. So we're going to put the throttles in reverse mode, and then as we advance the throttle, we're actually going to get reverse thrust. We're going to take the parking brake off, and we're going to do our own pullback here. So a little bit of reverse thrust, get us moving. Give it a little bit of a twist. That's probably enough. And make sure we don't roll forward. All right, let's taxi out of here. Okay, we're just going to head down the taxiway now. And down at the end, then we're going to stop and we're going to do some run-up testing, and we're going to take a look at that interaction between the props and the throttles, as I was talking about. The Twin Otter does like to taxi at a pretty good speed, so I do end up tapping the brakes a lot here to keep it from getting too fast. You can modulate that. You can actually put the engines into the props into feather mode, and you'll find that you can get a little bit finer control over your taxi speed, but I'm doing it with brakes right now. So as I said, once we get down here, we'll take a look at the power management system. I really do think it's one of the things about the Twin Otter that makes it such an impressive short takeoff and landing aircraft. And it's not because of the amount of runway that it needs. It's also because of the amount of space that it needs to get both up and down. And we'll certainly find out when we climb out. You know, the prescribed takeoff for the Twin Otter is basically the max climb takeoff, and it's pretty impressive. But the other thing is that the way the power management system works is you can do a very rapid but very controlled descent as well, which can be important for getting into some of the areas that the Twin Otter needs to get into. So I think that's because of the way the power management system works, and I think it's kind of interesting. Really didn't appreciate it until I read the manual for the aircraft, so I thought we'd take a look at that. And then when we're flying, maybe we'll do a little test as well. So coming up to a spot here where we can pull over, aiming at the final taxiway, and we'll just come to a stop, and we'll put on the parking brake, and now we'll take a look. So we're in a configuration now where we have the prop levers full forward. So this would be our normal max climb, max cruise, and our landing configuration. There's really only two settings for the prop levers. You can have them full forward. They do allow you to have intermediate settings, but really the manual implies that you either want to be in full forward or full to the rear. When you are actually landing and taking off, you definitely want them in full forward. You see you get a warning light if they are in the cruise setting when you if they're in the cruise setting when your actual throttles will pulled back. So the prop levers can be set to essentially the cruise setting, which is 75%. but only when the throttles are advanced out of the idles region. And since they are in the idle region now, we get a warning light if we do that. So we're going to put the prop full forward, and we're going to take a look at the power lever. So the power lever, you can see, is in the idle setting. And what the idle setting essentially means is that the control of the prop speed is now actually connected to the throttle. So if I advance the throttle here a little bit, once I get it up to the point where we're truly out of idle, you'll see that the props are actually responding to the throttle. I'm not changing the props, I'm only changing the throttle, but I am getting movement on the prop dials. So in this region, which the manual refers to as the idle region, the power is not only controlling the prop. Say that again. The power is not only controlling the torque, but it's controlling the prop as well. Now, when I get it up into a region, the actual operating region, or the constant speed region, now the props are basically set to maximum and controlled by the prop lever, and even as I increase the throttle, I don't get any movement on the props. So from maximum, maybe around 50 inches of torque, all the way down past 30, the props are in the constant speed mode. And if I wanted to pull the props back to cruise, I could pull them back to cruise, and they'll go back to 75%, and they're not affected by the power setting. So that's the way we would cruise. But let's say we want to descend. I'm actually going to put the prop levers all the way forward, so we get maximum speed. But now as I reduce the throttle, I will eventually get back into the idle region, where now I am controlling the prop speed as well. And the interesting thing about that is that when I pull the power well back, the props now descend into a region where they're basically not adding any forward thrust, but they are actually still adding a lot of drag. And so what this allows us to do is actually control our speed where we can descend fairly rapidly without actually gaining speed, because we're actually using essentially the props as speed brakes. And this is a very interesting situation. And unlike speed brakes, the thing about this is that when we're in idle, we're using the props essentially to slow us down, but we can very rapidly make the transition by smoothly moving the props back up, smoothly moving the power back up, and now I'm actually generating a lot of thrust again with the props. And I can alternate between these two modes where I'm using the props to decelerate and using the props to accelerate by varying the power. And so this gives us a lot of control over the descent rate of the aircraft. And when we're out flying, we'll take a look at that and see how we can actually use this to manage a very steep descent, but then to end that descent very rapidly and come back to a more even descent rate so that we can actually land. And I think it may not be unique to the Twin Otter, but it's the first time I've come across it in a simulated aircraft, and it really does lend the aircraft some interesting performance. So I'm looking forward to going out and taking a look at that while we fly. Okay, we've left our run-up position and we're coming up to the full stop line here. We're just going to take a quick moment and set up the nav system. I'm not going to use the flight plan that came in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Just want to use a straight flight plan that just takes us direct to Moncton, which is CYQM. So just get that set up here on the 530. You can see on the 530 we also have a couple of nav frequencies set. And let me just take a look at a chart here and show you what we're going to be doing. So basically we're going to take off out of Charlottetown on runway 4, and then we're going to come back around. We're basically going to do a VOR to VOR flight plan. So we're going to pick up the 282 radial out of the Charlottetown VOR, and that's going to point us directly to the Moncton VOR. About halfway to Moncton, we'll switch the radios and start following the inbound radial to Moncton instead of the outbound radial to Charlottetown. And then as we approach the Moncton VOR, what we're actually going to do is kind of a VME circle. We're going to use the GPS to give us distance readings, and we're going to shape our course around here so that we end up at about 12 nautical miles from the airport, and set up so that we can follow the 240 radial in across the Moncton VOR, which will take us to runway 24 in Moncton. So that's how we're going to fly the flight plan. And so let's set up the VOR instruments in the cockpit to allow us to do that. So we have two instruments in the cockpit that will allow us to use a VOR. The first is kind of a very typical CDI, course deviation indicator here with the broken arrow in the middle. We're going to set that to the radial out from Charlottetown, so about 101, 102. And this second one we're going to set to our actual course we're going to fly, which is going to be about 281, 282. No reason for doing both of them differently other than just because we can. All right, so as we get ready to taxi here, you can take a look. You'll notice if you look at the Garmin 530 and 430 stack over there, the radio frequencies on the 530 are connected to the first CDI that we set, and the radio frequencies on the second one are connected to the second instrument. Now, both of them are currently tuned to the Charlottetown VOR, but in the middle of the flight, we will be able to switch one over to Moncton first before we switch the other. So we can kind of use that as a cross-check if that's what we want to do. We could also use that if we didn't have the GPS, or even if we wanted to check the GPS, we could actually use the two VORs to basically do a bit of cross bearings, sort of triangulation. I know that's something you can do with VORs. I haven't ever practiced it, but maybe that's something we can do in a future video. Okay, we're getting ourselves out on the runway here, and once we are lined up, we'll put on the brakes and get ready to get the party started. Right about there. Parking brake on. Okay, so the last thing we have to do before we take off is get ourselves 10% flaps. We'll also notice on the indicator up there on the windscreen that the flaps are coming down. It's a handy way without having to look overhead. We're just about ready. Oh, actually, I forgot something here. Let me put the brakes back on for a sec. I'm going to set the heading bug here to the current runway heading. I find that's useful because honestly, with the angle of climb during the climb out, it's actually kind of hard to keep your heading. I find that reference to be pretty helpful. Okay, we're doing a little bit of a rolling start here. Everything looks good. Going to advance the throttle slowly. What I'm looking for is I want to hear the props go into that constant speed governor mode as we come out of idle. I watch the props spool up, and then once I'm sure that they're responding, then I'm going to put the throttles all the way to the firewall. And at a little over 70 knots, we're going to pull back and rotate, and off we come. And, you know, keeping it, you're supposed to climb out at 80 knots, which is quite slow, and I find it's actually difficult to actually pull up at that speed. And once we're past about 400 feet, we bring up the flaps. That brings our nose down a little bit. You can see that is a very impressive climb out angle that the Twin Otter can achieve. And that's supposed to be your normal takeoff. I'm not exactly sure whether passengers would appreciate that or not. You can see that I've actually slipped below the 80 or above the 80 knots, let the nose fall down a little bit. I'll try and pull it back up here a little, just to give you some impression of what the real climb out performance is like. And once again, I think that this is an important aspect of the Twin Otter performance. It's not just the length of the runway that the Twin Otter can use. It's also the amount of space that it takes to get down and get back up again from those runways that allow it to get into some very remote locations. And although I'm not doing a very good job of holding that speed consistently here, I also think that that's one of the really interesting things to try and simulate. Okay, so we've reached about 2,000 feet, so I've pulled the props back to cruise. Got to watch the power there, get the power back under the red line, and now I'm going to let the climb out speed climb all the way to 100 whole knots. And we're going to do the remainder of the climb out here at a slightly more humane 100 knots instead of at the 80 max climb. And we're also going to start our turn to the left here and come around and look to find the Charlottetown VOR radial so we can get our course set for Moncton. Okay, so I'm watching the middle CDI there, and I want to turn maybe about 30, maybe a little bit more degrees past the expected outbound course, and then we'll roll out on that course, and we'll just wait for the CDI to click to the middle. See the runway there down to the left. The VOR, almost overhead the VOR now, I think, if I remember the map. So we're just going to stay here until we actually get both of the course deviation needles reading, and then we'll have to come back a little bit to the right, and we'll be on our course for Moncton. All right, everything looks good. We're still going to climb out. We're coming out beam of the airport now. Look at Charlottetown and environs this cool winter's afternoon. And we're going to continue our climb here for a little while. We're aiming for about 8,000 feet today as cruising altitude. Oh, one thing that we want to do, I didn't actually show setting the trim because I used my HOTAS to do it, but there is a takeoff trim setting, which is slightly to the right on the rudder. And I really think that's because if you do the max climb out, you get a little bit of gyroscopic effect, and you tend to bear a little bit to the left. I think it's actually more about what happens after takeoff than what happens on the runway in the Twin Otter, but it does help to have a little bit of right rudder in during takeoff, but then you take it out once you get into cruise. Okay, so we're in a nice cruise climb here. We're watching both of the CDIs to see when they start telling us we're getting close to being intercepting our course to Moncton. We're just watching the altitude climb up slowly. It's all probably going to come together at around the same time. And once we get to the point, yep, there come the CDI needles. They're coming in. So we're going to start a turn to the right here. And the trick is always to manage the turn rate to try and get on heading just as you eliminate the last of the deviation. And we're still pretty close to Charlottetown, so they're still pretty sensitive, so it's probably going to take a little bit of jiggling. Probably wouldn't be the end of the world if we're a little bit off at this point, but we might as well try and get them zeroed out if we can. Try to stay in our cruise climb here a little bit longer. Jockey those needles into the middle. Keep the climb going. Okay, I think we're basically on the course line now, so we're going to come back to the right. Get the needles centered up there. We got a degree or two difference between the two dials, but nothing too much to worry about. Keep the cruise going, watching the altitude. Still got about another 1,000 feet to go before we level off. So we're get ourselves established on course here. And just wait for the altitude to come up to cruise altitude. Once we get on course and on altitude, then I'll do a quick demo of at least the basic autopilot functions to show you that they do actually function in the aircraft, although they don't you don't use them through the glass cockpit the way you would with the Garmin 1000. And that's actually one of the things I like about the aircraft. It still has all of that functionality, but it has it implemented in a much more 1950s, 1960s kind of way than modern, and I actually enjoy that. That makes flying the aircraft enjoyable to me because it's different than a lot of the other aircraft in DCS. So last couple hundred feet here of the climb, we're starting to level off. And once we get fairly close to where we want to be, we're going to enable the autopilot. We're basically going to put the autopilot on in 3 stages. The first stage is just going to enable the autopilot, and it's going to basically maintain our current altitude and course. And then I'm going to put it in heading mode so we can get some finer steering using the heading bug on the course deviation indicator. And then lastly, I'm going to put it in altitude hold. So we'll put the autopilot on now. And now, so the aircraft is maintaining its altitude and course. Now I'm going to set the heading bug to where we want it to be, and hit the heading mode, and now the aircraft is steering itself, and you can see we kind of lost the plot on our course line, so we're steering a little bit left, of course, using the heading knob. And I'm just going to let the aircraft climb up the last little bit, and once we're basically at 8,000 feet, I'm going to hit the Alt button, and that's going to set our target altitude to our current altitude, and it is also going to enable altitude hold mode. Okay, so we just need to wait till we get exactly back on course, and then we'll use the heading bug to steer onto our course line again. Just going to chivvy it up a couple more, about another 100 feet, and then we can get it into altitude hold mode. So we're just about on course line again, so we'll move the heading bug back to the actual course we want. And we're just driving out the last few 100 feet of altitude. Okay, rather than doing all of that, let's skip forward in time a little bit till we're out closer to the coast here. Time lapse. Yeah, so we're closer to the coast, and now I'm going to actually take it out of autopilot. You can see we were already in altitude hold mode. So we flew out here. Going to take it out of autopilot so we can do our little demonstration of using the power system, doing a rapid descent here. So we're out of autopilot. I am putting the throttles back to full power, because you need to have them in full power for a powered descent. So once they're full forward, now I am pulling the throttles back all the way to the stop, and I'm holding stick pressure to try and basically maintain altitude and let the speed drop, and the nose is dropping on me anyways. And once we get the speed to around 100, we'll start putting down the flaps. So there's 10 degrees of flaps. Once we get down to about 95, we can start putting them all the way down. And then once the speed gets down to about 80, we're going to let the nose drop. Get a nice view of the fixed link, the flink that joins Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick there outside the left-hand window. All right, so now you can see we're at 80 knots. And the nose is continuing to drop, and our vertical speed is the thing you really want to be looking at. We're only going 80 knots forward, but we're actually dropping at almost 2,000 feet per minute, which is a pretty stunning descent rate, but it's very manageable and very controlled because we're only going forward at 80 knots. The nose is nice and steeply down so we can see our target. If we want to let the speed creep up to, say, 95, which is the end of the flap zone, we got the flaps all the way down now. See, we can definitely sustain even a little bit more than 2,000 feet per minute descent, which is a pretty impressive descent rate, but it's very manageable, very controlled, nice nose down attitude so we could see our target we were coming into. And we get that effect because essentially we're allowing the props to act as speed brakes when the throttle is in idle. But now, as we'll see, we can arrest that descent very quickly by moving the throttles back into a thrust position. All we have to do is start advancing the throttle here in just a sec. And I'm going to push the throttles forward, and I'm just going to try and keep the same speed. You'll see that you'll hear the props when they go into constant speed mode. That oh-so characteristic sound that anybody who's flown in a Twin Otter has heard before. And by the time we get there, you can see that in order to maintain the speed, I'm actually already climbing. So just that was all that it took to go from 2,000 feet down to basically level, or even a little bit more than level. In fact, if we fly level, the speed is starting to come up, and we'd be out of the flap range here soon enough if we didn't actually climb a little at full power. Okay, well, I'm going to climb back up to cruise altitude and get back on course here. And we'll pick this flight up a little bit closer to Moncton. Okay, we're picking up the flight here about halfway into the flight, as you can see if you look at the 530 there. I really wanted to go through that power demonstration because, like I said, I think that's one of the really unique performance characteristics of the Twin Otter, and really not something you can do in a lot of Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft. And so I think that's another reason why you might want to try the Twin Otter. I think it's one of the most impressive things about the Twin Otter is its ability to get into and out of tight places, which partly is stall performance, but it's also partly its power management system. And it's a fact that's a little bit more subtle in the manual, but I think that is something that's really characteristic of the airplane. So now we're about halfway, so I think it's time to start switching our nav system over to the Moncton VOR. So I've switched the bottom radio to the second channel, and now I am going to dial up 240 on that CDI, because eventually that's the course that we want to fly inbound on the Moncton VOR and its reading, so there's no reason not to switch over both CDIs. So we'll switch the second one over, and same thing, we're going to set it to 240 as well, because that's the course that we eventually want to fly over the Moncton VOR. Because if we fly over the Moncton VOR at 240, then we'll be lined up with runway 24 in Moncton. So we're going to manage our approach so that we can do that. Just going to fly a little bit closer. Okay, here we are at around 20 nautical miles out from the airport. And while we're waiting to get a little closer, it's probably time to start descending now from 8,000 feet. See if we can get the autopilot to help us with that. Now, I'm trying to get it to pick up a vertical speed guidance, but it's not doing that. So this panel that I'm accessing here is the autopilot panel. It has basically the same buttons as the panel in front of the pilot up here. Right over there, no, it's not working either. I think the problem is that I still have a target altitude, a set altitude of 8,000 feet. So I'm going to turn that down, get a warning as soon as I do that, because now we're outside of our altitude limits. Now I should be able to get, yes, now I can give it vertical speed guidance. And it's going to start taking us down at 1,000 feet per minute. And the altimeter's unwinding and the VSI says 1,000, so that's good. So we're still on the same course that we flew out from Charlottetown on. And pretty soon here we're going to be close enough that we're going to want to start actually starting kind of our DME circle away from Moncton, so that we can intercept the radial over the VOR at around 12 nautical miles, something like that. I'd like to get set up at about 12 nautical miles out on 240 degrees and at about 4,000 feet. That's what I'm kind of trying to manage here. So I wanted to fly the flight plan this way. You know, as I said, the three things that I really wanted to show you in the Twin Otter today was the power management system and the way you can control your ascent and descent rates in some pretty impressive ways. And the other thing I just wanted to show was how to actually use the almost steam gauge navigation system. We do have the two Garmins, the 530 and the 430, but other than that, it's pretty much all analog gauges. And I just wanted to show you how we can do it. You know, it wouldn't qualify as a precision approach, but it's still, you know, it's going to be a precise approach anyways to the airport, using the autopilot here and using the two VOR gauges, the two course deviation indicators that we have in the cockpit. So we're still got a few kilometers to go before we want to start bearing off to the right. We're going to use the autopilot for as long as I can to manage everything rather than flying it by hand. So we're down to 6,000 feet at 15 nautical miles. That's not bad. And we still aren't getting any readings on either of the CDIs. Still too far out from that. We're getting down under 15 nautical miles now, so it's going to be pretty soon time to start turning to the right. Yeah, we're down around 13, so let's just start a slow turn to the right. If necessary, I'll turn as much as 90 degrees to the right and get so that I end up with the VOR off my wingtip at about 12 nautical miles, and then I will turn in. So we're just gonna do that slowly. There's no reason to do any dramatic movements. We're not really doing a full classic VME or DME circle here, but we're just kind of shaping ourselves around. Time to start giving a little bit more to the right. And keeping an eye on the altitude as it comes down under 5,000 feet. So you're spending a lot of time with my head in the cockpit on this flight using these instruments, although we're not flying IFR. I'm just going to use this setting to gauge exactly where the VOR is. So I can use my second CDI to tell me exactly where the VOR is. It's at 270 right now, so we can afford to bear off a little bit more. Yeah, we're a little bit under the 12 nautical miles I was looking for, and it's probably time to stop descending for the moment. Want to be at around 4,000 feet when we turn in. We'll just keeping track of the VOR. When I turn this, whatever it stops out is the current bearing to the VOR. So you can see the VOR is moving to our left, where we want it to be. And we're at about 90 degrees to it, so we don't need to turn the course anymore. We just need to keep track. Know how to time our turn in. Getting pretty close to it now, so we're going to start to turn in. And as we come around, we're going to look out there and try to pick up the runway. And I think I have it out there. It's pretty hard to see in the haze today. We're just going to finish the turn. You can see the CDI needle centered. There's the runway in the middle of the windscreen on the left. And so pretty soon we're going to basically take over visual nav from the instruments, but we can use the autopilot a little while longer. So we're around 10 nautical miles, but we're 4,000 feet up, so we could afford to start descending a little bit more. But given that we're flying in a Twin Otter, we're not going to be too worried if we're a little too high. Now the warning tone is because once again we're entering the zone of the 3,000 feet set mark. It gives you a tone about 1,000 feet above or below if you've exceeded it. So I've set it back down to 1,000 now, and now we're putting the props into descent mode. So prop lever full forward. Not looking at the CDI anymore. I'm just watching the runway come up. And we're starting to pull back the power to pull back the speed. Once we get down to 100, we can drop the flaps, so probably time to turn off the autopilot now. And just gentle back pressure, working the speed down to 100, get the flaps down at 10. We still got a ways to go to the runway. Not in any hurry. Let's get a little bit closer before we put the flaps down. We're just holding the runway there in view, maintaining that. Coming down at about 1,000 feet per minute. It's a pretty good descent rate. And the flaps are coming down now. And the descent rate's coming up a little bit. That's okay. We're going to slowly let our speed drop down towards 80 on the approach now. And we probably want to flatten that a little bit. Yeah, the manual says that a standard approach is 20 degrees of flap down. but obviously you can use the 30 or the 40 settings if you want to. I tend to like to use 30. I just like the nose position at 30 a little bit more than I do at 20. But, you know, really that's your preference. Okay, so we're getting down to close to 1,000 feet now. Keeping an eye on the runway. Still going 90 knots. Need to get too slow just yet. We're still 5 miles out. And we're just trying to make sure we stay on the runway heading there. Trimming it out a little bit here. So you can see doing a standard approach in a Twin Otter does hopefully does not have a whole lot of moments of high drama. It's a fairly measured process, which is good. You can also see that in the absence of any wind, I don't have any significant wind programmed in today. It's very stable. It's actually a real pleasure to fly the aircraft. And it has a good feel. It's not doesn't fly like a cartoon. You know, it does have unique flying characteristics, but it is very stable. And it does pretty much what's expected of it. So we're adding some flaps now. I've got the flaps down to 30, that's where I want them, and we're pulling the speed back to around 80. And that means adding a little bit of power, and that's good because we want the props up out of that real speed brake range. It's a little bit easy to get into sort of some pilot-induced oscillation if you're constantly going back and forth between the high drag region and the high thrust region. So I'm finding part of the art of landing the Twin Otter is to get your approach to the point where you're in one of those regions or the other. You don't really want to be going back and forth between them. So we're kind of at the low end of the thrust region, and we pull back the power too far, you can see the nose drops and the ascent rate climbs pretty dramatically. So we're just kind of walking the hairy edge of the line here. Speed's getting a little low. Let's get the nose down. So, you know, you definitely know that you're flying an aircraft here. It's not just point at the runway and go, and that's good, but it's also very manageable. I think it's, you know, very enjoyable. It's something I'm looking forward to getting a lot better at, and even with a little bit of time on the airplane, I feel like I'm already learning to fly it a lot better. And I think that's one of the things that recommends the Twin Otter to me, is that it's an aircraft that there is a fair bit to learn to fly it well. I can't just jump in and fly it as well as I would like to. And I think that's one of the things that I'm really enjoying about it, is that there is a lot to learn. And there are things to learn that really I don't get to do in pretty much any other aircraft I fly, either in this simulator or in DCS. Okay, under 1,000 feet now.
500.
And that's nice. We get the voice telling us 500, and we're going to get the announcement of minimums. I don't know if you can change that number, change the minimums, but it's preset, I think, at around 300 feet. And we're just holding on, getting a little bumpy here as we get close. Managing the descent rate. Don't really want it over 500.
Minimums.
Here's minimums. Around 200 feet, I guess. And we're going to get the 100s, and then we're going to count down. I find it's very useful, so I don't have to have my head down looking at the numbers.
40.
We flare, hold the power on until the descent rate drops off, and then pull the power back. And we're down. We're actually doing a wheelie down the runway. I didn't even realize that. Probably was a little bit early. I got the props in reverse. You can hear them coming in there, but it's probably a little bit early. I'm not sure the nose wheel was down when I did that, which was probably a mistake. One of those things I need to learn. And so you modulate the power with reverse as well, and don't really want to kill the speed entirely at an airport like this. But you can see that we could stop in a pretty briskly if we needed to. Well, that's pretty much going to wrap it up for me, because I'm here in Moncton. And I hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the Aerosoft Twin Otter model for Microsoft Flight Simulator. As I said at the beginning, I certainly highly recommend the model. I think there's a lot of interesting things you can do in this aircraft that are pretty hard to do in just about any other aircraft. So I think you should give it a try. I'm really looking forward to learning how to fly it a lot better.